The wind was sharp that evening, slicing through the narrow streets and rattling the brittle leaves clinging stubbornly to the trees. Elijah Carter walked briskly, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. His steel-toed boots scuffed the cracked pavement, each step echoing the fatigue of a long day at the auto shop. He glanced at his watch. There was still time to pick up his daughter, Amara, from her after-school program. That thought brought a faint smile to his lips, a small bright spot in an otherwise gray existence. Life in Bridgeport was a grind, but Elijah had learned to keep his head down and focus on what mattered, keeping food on the table and his daughter safe. Yet, despite his quiet nature, he carried the weight of a man who knew the unspoken rules. He moved cautiously, avoiding the wrong stairs and steering clear of places where the air felt heavy with judgment. As he rounded the corner, the faint sound of sirens began to swell in the distance. He thought little of it at first. Sirens were as common as street lamps in Bridgeport. But his heart sank when he noticed a patrol car slowing to a stop just a few yards ahead. Two officers stepped out, their faces shadowed by the dull orange glow of the streetlights. "Hey, you!" One of them barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Come here."
Elijah froze.
He turned slowly, lifting his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with unease. The taller officer exchanged a look with his partner before stepping closer. "Where are you coming from?" "Work," Elijah answered. "I'm just heading home." The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning Elijah as though his very existence was suspicious. Without warning, the second officer reached for Elijah's arm. "Hey, hold on," Elijah protested, instinctively pulling back. That was all it took. Resisting arrest. The taller officer shouted as he shoved Elijah against the cold brick wall. The impact sent a sharp pain radiating through Elijah's chest. Before he could process what was happening, the officers were on him, pinning his arms behind his back and snapping cold handcuffs onto his wrists. "What's going on? I didn't do anything." Elijah's voice cracked with frustration, but it fell on deaf ears. "Suspected robbery in the area," the shorter officer muttered as if that explained everything. Hours later, Elijah sat on a hard metal bench in a holding cell, his hands trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. Around him were men of all ages and backgrounds, but they all wore the same resigned expression. Faces hardened by experiences that told them the system was rigged against them. When his release finally came the next morning, it wasn't justice that set him free but the absence of evidence. The officers didn't even have the decency to apologize. Elijah walked out of the precinct, his body aching and his pride shattered. But deep inside, something stirred, a seed of resolve. "This isn't over," he whispered to himself as he stepped into the harsh light of the morning sun. The weeks following Elijah's arrest were a blur of restless nights and simmering anger. He couldn't shake the memory of the cold cuffs biting into his wrists or the smug smirk on the officer's face. But it wasn't just about him. The incident had cast a shadow over his relationship with his daughter. Amara, only 8 years old, had overheard whispers from neighbors and classmates, questions about her father's integrity that no child should face. "I didn't do anything wrong, baby," Elijah assured her one night as he tucked her into bed. His voice wavered, but his gaze was steady. "And I'm going to prove it. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been treated like that." That promise became his anchor. Elijah spent his evenings poring over law books borrowed from the local library, his fingers running over the pages as if searching for answers hidden between the lines. He enrolled in community college part-time, juggling classes with work at the auto shop. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but every time doubt crept in, he thought of Amara's wide eyes, full of hope. He couldn't fail her. 10 years later, Elijah Carter was unrecognizable. The once overworked mechanic was now a respected attorney with a reputation for taking on cases that others deemed unwinnable. He had become a symbol of resilience in Bridgeport, fighting for victims of racial profiling and police misconduct. His courtroom victories made headlines, but it was his unwavering dedication to justice that earned him the respect of the community. It was during one of these high-profile cases, a lawsuit against the Bridgeport Police Department, that the mayor approached him with an unusual proposition. "Elijah," the mayor began, leaning across his desk, "we need someone who can bring real change to this city, someone who understands both sides of the coin. I want you to consider running for chief of police." The words hung in the air, heavy with irony. Elijah stared at the mayor, his mind reeling. "Chief of police?" he echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. "You want me to lead the same department that tried to ruin my life?" The mayor nodded. "That's exactly why you're the right person for the job. You've seen the worst of it, Elijah, but you've also shown the city what's possible when we fight for what's right." Elijah didn't answer immediately. The idea seemed absurd yet tantalizing. Could he really reform the system from within? Elijah's appointment as chief of police sent shockwaves through the city. Supporters hailed it as a historic victory, while detractors claimed it was a political stunt. Within the department, the reception was icy. Many officers bristled at the idea of taking orders from a man they viewed as an outsider. One officer, in particular, seemed determined to undermine Elijah at every turn. Sergeant Ryan Mallory, the same man who had arrested him all those years ago. "You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything?" Mallory sneered during their first encounter in the precinct. "You don't belong here, Carter." Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "I belong wherever I choose to be, Sergeant. And I'm here to make sure this department becomes something the people of this city can trust again." Despite the resistance, Elijah threw himself into the role. He implemented mandatory bias training, overhauled disciplinary procedures, and established community outreach programs. He spent long hours meeting with residents, listening to their concerns and finding ways to bridge the divide between the police and the people they served. The tension between Elijah and Mallory reached a boiling point one night when a heated exchange turned personal. "Why don't you just admit it?" Mallory snapped. "This is about revenge. You're still that guy I arrested, crying about fairness." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he took a deep breath before responding. "You're right. I am that guy. But unlike you, I've learned from my mistakes. I'm not here to settle old scores, Mallory. I'm here because this city deserves better than what you've been giving it." Mallory scoffed, but something in his eyes flickered. A brief, grudging respect that he would never admit out loud. Over time, Elijah's efforts began to bear fruit. Crime rates decreased and public trust in the police began to recover. Even some of his staunchest critics within the department started to see the value in his leadership. One evening, Mallory approached Elijah in his office. His posture was awkward, his usual bravado replaced by an unfamiliar humility. "I was wrong about you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you had it in you, but you've done good work here." Elijah looked at him, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "It's not about me, Mallory. It's about this city. We all have a part to play." Years later, as Elijah prepared to step down from his role, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The man who had once been silenced by injustice had become a voice for change, transforming a broken system into a beacon of hope. At his retirement ceremony, Amara, now a lawyer herself, stood by his side. "You kept your promise, Dad," she said, her voice full of pride. Elijah smiled, his eyes misty. "We kept it together, kid." As the crowd erupted into applause, Elijah Carter knew one thing for certain. His fight had been worth every step, every scar, and every sleepless night. He had turned pain into purpose, proving that even in the face of injustice, greatness could rise.